The year is 1803. On the mist-shrouded Isle of Skye, hundreds of families are packing their meager belongings. They are leaving the only home their ancestors have ever known, guided not by a desperate captain, but by a Scottish earl with a radical vision. They are boarding 3 ships, the Polly, the Dykes, and the Oughton. They are bound for a tiny, heavily forested island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It is a voyage that will entirely redefine the population of Prince Edward Island. It is the story of the Selkirk Settlers, and it is a story that is worth hearing. But looking at these stones in the graveyard where they were buried and tracing their lineages, you have to ask a difficult historical question. Is it an act of mercy to uproot a people, or is it an act of erasure? When Lord Selkirk offered these Highlanders a new life across the Atlantic, was he saving them from a devastation of the Highland Clearances, or was he just finishing the job the landlords had started? To understand the sheer desperation would drive 800 people into the dark hold of a wooden ship, we have to look at what they were leaving behind. The year is 1803, but the tragedy had been brewing for decades. Imagine for a moment the life of a typical tenant farmer, a crofter on the Isle of Skye. You live in what's called a black house. It's a long, low stone cottage with a thatched roof. A peat fire burns constantly in the center of the dirt floor, filling this room with thick, sweet smoke. You do not own the land beneath your feet, but you have something called dúftas, a deeply ingrained centuries-old Gaelic belief that because your ancestors bled and died for the clan chief, you have an inalienable right to live on that land. In the Highland mindset, the chief wasn't a landlord, he was the father of the clan. But by the turn of the 19th century, the fathers had changed. The clan chiefs had assimilated. They had become British aristocrats. They spent their time in London, and London high society was incredibly expensive. They needed cash, and they found their fortune, not in their people, but in a new four-legged tenant, the Cheviot sheep. The landlords realized a cold economic truth. A hillside covered in sheep yielded a massive profit in the wool trade. A hillside covered in human tenants barely yield enough oats and barley to pay the rent. And so the Highland Clearances began. The eviction notices arrived, and if you didn't leave your ancestral home voluntarily, the landlord's men made sure you did. They would wait until you were out, or sometimes simply drag you out by force and set fire to the roof timbers. In a landscape almost devoid of trees, the roof timbers were the most valuable part of the house. Without them, you couldn't rebuild, so you were instantly, devastatingly homeless. So where did you go? Many families were pushed to the barren, rocky coastlines. Here they were forced into the grueling kelp industry. The landlords trapped them on the coast to harvest seaweed, burning it into ash to be sold to factories making glass and soap. It was back-breaking, toxic work, and the landlords took almost all the profit. The British government even passed the Passenger Vessels Act of 1803. They claimed it was for safety, but its real purpose was to triple the cost of a ship's ticket to America, trapping the Highlanders in Scotland as a cheap labor force. The Highlands were bleeding out, and this is exactly where Thomas Douglas, the 5th Earl of Selkirk, steps in to our story. Selkirk was an anomaly. He was a wealthy lowland aristocrat, but he had toured the Highlands and was horrified by the poverty and cruelty of the Clearances. He wrote extensively about it. Where other lords saw an inconvenience, Selkirk saw a proud ancient culture being systematically dismantled. Selkirk realized a painful truth. The old Highland way of life was dead. It could not be resurrected in Scotland. The economic forces were simply too strong. He believed that the only way to save the Gaelic language, the community bonds, and the dignity of the people was to move them entirely. He envisioned a new world settlement where the Highland culture could breathe, free from the tyranny of the landlords. So Selkirk took action. He bought land, a massive amount of it, or 80,000 acres in the Belfast area of Prince Edward Island. And then he made an unprecedented offer to the displaced crofters of Skye and the surrounding areas. He offered land at reasonable terms. He offered provisions to get them started. For a crofter facing eviction and starvation, it was a lifeline. But it was a lifeline that required you to sell off everything you owned, leave your homeland forever, and cross the North Atlantic in hurricane season. Imagine, if you can, the conversations happening inside those small, smoke-filled blockhouses on the Isle of Skye in the summer of 1803. The eviction notices had arrived. The landlord's men were circling. The debate wasn't about seeking an adventure. It was an agonizing choice between two terrifying realities. Do we stay and face certain ruin on the rocky shores, or do we sell everything we own, board a wooden ship, and risk drowning in the North Atlantic? When you look at the passenger list of the Polly, the Dykes, and the Oughton, you aren't just looking at names. You are looking at entire communities making a collective leap of faith. Take the McDonald's, for example. There were dozens of McDonald's on those ships. For generations, the name McDonald meant power in the Highlands. They were the lords of the Isle. Now families like the McDonalds or Snizort were pooling their meager savings just to afford the passage. The older generation was terrified. They had heard the horror stories of shipwrecks, disease, of people dying in the dark holds of ships. For a 50-year-old crofter who had never left his native glen, the ocean was a death sentence. But the younger generation saw something entirely different. They saw Lord Selkirk's offer. He wasn't just offering passage, he was offering land. The possibility of owning the very soil you tilled was completely impossible back in Scotland. It was a revolutionary concept. And then there were the McKinnons, another ancient Highland name deeply tied to land. You see families with young children, infants even listed on those manifests. The parents had to look at those children and decide, do we raise them as landless, starving kelp gatherers on the coast of Scotland, or do we risk everything for the slim chance they might grow up as freeholders in a place called Prince Edward Island? It's a pattern we see over and over. Atlantic Canadian genealogy, whether it was the Selkirk Settlers in 1803 or the later waves of ghost immigrants slipping out of Scotland in the following decades, like my own ancestor Farquhar Campbell, who left the Isle of Coal, the driving force was the same. The land they loved could no longer hold them. In the end, for the people of Skye in 1803, the debate was settled. Roughly 800 people made the hardest choice of their lives. They chose the ocean. In August 1803, the Polly, the Dykes, and the Oughton weighed anchor. As the jagged coastline of Scotland faded into the grey horizon, a profound psychological shift occurred. They ceased to be Highlanders attached to their ancestral glens. They were now emigrants. There was no turning back.
Excuse me, Brian. May I interrupt?
You all remember AI Andy, my genealogy AI assistant? Hi, Andy.
Brian, I've been running the logistics on the Polly and the Dykes, and frankly, the data is alarming.
How so, Andy?
It's a masterclass in inefficiency. Based on the registered tonnage of these vessels and the passenger manifests, these people had less personal space than a modern economy airline seat. For weeks on end. And the sanitation protocols. I'd rather not process that data. It was a floating petri dish.
It was an 1803 crossing, Andy. It was a different time.
Statistically speaking, the anxiety levels must have been off the charts. You have hundreds of people who have never been on the open ocean, packed into a dark, damp hold, experiencing continuous severe motion.
Andy's data is terrifying because it's entirely accurate. The voyage of the Polly, the Dykes, and the Oughton wasn't a cruise to a new life. It was a brutal test of human endurance. For weeks, the people on these three ships battled severe seasickness, cramped quarters, and the terrifying, mind-numbing boredom of the open ocean. Imagine the reality of steerage in 1803. You're below deck in near total darkness. The ceilings are so low you cannot stand up straight. You are surrounded by the smells of unwashed bodies, seasickness, and damp wall. The sound of the timber creaking as the ship pitches and rolls in the North Atlantic swells is a constant and deafening. You share a small wooden bunk with your entire family. There is no privacy. There is no escape. And then there were the provisions. Lord Selkirk, to his credit, was meticulous in his planning. He wanted his settlers to survive. He mandated specific rations, far better than what many independent captains provided later in the century. But better is a relative term. In 1803, the staple of the diet was oatmeal. Everyday oatmeal, sometimes mixed with a little molasses if you were lucky. The protein came from heavily salted pork or beef pulled from barrels that had been sitting in the damp hold. To make it edible, it had to be soaked in water, but fresh water was strictly rationed. The ship carried a supply of hardtack, dense dry biscuits, and that often became infested with weevils. Cooking this food meant going above deck to the communal galley fires. But when the storms hit, and they always hit in the North Atlantic, the captain ordered the hatches battered down. The fires were extinguished for safety. The families and steerage were locked below in the pitch black, unable to cook, unable to breathe fresh air, sometimes for days at a time, while the ship violently pitched above them. And in those dark, damp conditions, illness spread like wildfire. Ship fever, what we now know as typhus, was a constant threat. Dysentery and cholera were common. The ship's surgeon, if they even had a competent one, had little to offer beyond basic remedies and amputation. We know from the records that the crossing was not without tragedy. While the Polly, Dykes, and Oughton did not suffer the catastrophic death tolls seen on the coffin ships of the Irish famine decades later, they still lost people. Children weakened by the cramped conditions and poor diet were particularly vulnerable. The agonizing reality of an ocean crossing was that when a family member died, there was no graveyard, there was only a brief somber service on deck and a burial at sea. But there was also life amidst the suffering. Women gave birth in those dark holes, bringing new Highlanders into the world somewhere between the old world and the new. The resilience of these people, the MacDonalds, the MacLeods, the McKinnons, and others was forged not when they landed in Canada, but during those terrifying weeks on the open water. The Polly was the fastest of the three. It had caught better winds and managed to stay ahead of the worst weather. After weeks of nothing but gray ocean and a horizon that offered no hope, the lookout finally spotted the coastline of Prince Edward Island. On Sunday, August 7th, 1803, the Polly dropped anchor in Orwell Bay. The Dykes arrived 2 days later on August 9th. The Oughton would trail behind, battling contrary winds, arriving towards the end of the month. They had crossed the terrifying void, but as they looked out at the shoreline, the true test was only just beginning. Finally, the cry of land echoed across the decks. They sailed into Orwell Bay. They had made it. They had survived the crossing to the Golden Land. Except it wasn't golden. It was green and dense and incredibly empty. There was no bustling port waiting for them, no houses, just an imposing, impenetrable wall of spruce and fir trees, and swarms of mosquitoes the size of small birds. The dream they had nurtured in the holds of the ship collided violently with reality. So they made it. The Polly, the Dykes, and eventually the Oughton had arrived. But the clock was ticking, and it was ticking fast. It was late August. In Scotland, the winters are damp, dreary, and cold. In Atlantic Canada, the winters are deadly. The true enemy they faced now wasn't a ruthless landlord back in Scotland. It was the temperature. It was the rapidly approaching frost. Imagine stepping off that ship. You've been cramped in the dark for weeks. You are weak, you're disoriented, and you are standing on a shore covered in an impenetrable wall of spruce, fir, and pine. There are no houses, there are no roads, there isn't even a cleared field to pitch a tent. You have weeks, not months, to clear the virgin forest, build shelter, and prepare for the climate you cannot even fathom. Imagine the psychological toll as November rolled in. Isolated on an island encased in ice, thousands of miles from the heather of Skye, the provisions they brought were dwindling. The cold was seeping through the gaps in their hastily built log cabins. Many of them must have looked out at the frozen, alien landscape and thought, "We have made a terrible, fatal mistake."
Brian, I've adjusted the historical parameters to look at the macro-level data.
And what did you see?
I am looking at cultural retention versus physical risk. If they had stayed in Scotland, their physical survival rate in the short term was high. But their cultural retention rate, their language, their community structure, was mathematically approaching zero due to the clearances. By coming to Prince Edward Island, the physical risk spiked dramatically, but it was the only statistical path to save their identity. They didn't just survive the winter, Brian. They successfully transplanted the soul of the Highlands.
Spring 1804, the ice in the bay finally broke. They had survived, and with the thaw came a renewed energy. The axes came out in force. The trees fell, and those rough temporary log cabins began to turn into permanent farmhouses. The Selkirk settlement had taken root. Lord Selkirk was called many things in his lifetime: a visionary, a dreamer, a savior, and by some a fool. But for the thousands of descendants living in Atlantic Canada and scattered across North America today, he is simply the reason they are here. The Selkirk settlers preserved their identity not by clinging to the land of their ancestors, but by bravely moving it across the sea. Here is the hard truth of this story. The Selkirk settlers survived because the Earl was obsessed with the details. He didn't just put them on boats and send them into the woods. He gave them a structure. He mapped the lots. He managed the provisions. He planned the community. He was the architect of their survival. Genealogy is no different. You can have all the passion in the world, but with no strategy, you're just wandering in the wilderness. You gather names the way they gather timber, but you never actually build the house. If you're tired of hitting brick walls and feeling like your research is lost in the woods, you need a strategy. You need a plan to organize the chaos. And that is exactly what I do on my family history roadmap calls. It's a completely free 30-minute consultation where we sit down, look at your specific research goals, and create your roadmap using a proven strategy to get you there. It's the mentorship and direction I wish I had when I started doing this 35 years ago. You can book your free call right now using the link in the description. Don't let your hard work get lost in the woods. Get a strategy. And if you want to see how other families navigated these wild inland crossings, check out this playlist right here on the screen. And remember, every family has a story to tell, and every story is worth telling. So keep searching for your ancestors and have a great day.